welcome to another video. Today it is part 3 of the Butterick 5209 sew along. Today we're going to be assembling the skirt and putting it together with the dress and getting our dress finished. So let's get started. The next step is for front, stitch 2 skirt front and back sections together at centre. Gather upper edge of front between small circles and then prepare the back in the same manner. So I'm going to get the front and back centre seams sewn together, and they're going to be sewn with French seams. I've sewn the front and back together at 1/4 inch with the wrong sides together, and I'm now trimming off the excess seam allowance so that I end up with 1/8 inch left. I'm then going to take that to the ironing board and press it so the right sides are together, and then I can sew the final part of this French seam, which is 3/8 inch stitching line, which will enclose this raw edge. And this is for the centre front and the centre back, and I'm also going to do this for one side seam as well. The other side seam I'm going to be finishing with bias binding. I've sewn the final part of the French seam with 3/8 inch allowance, which has enclosed the raw edge nicely. I'm going to go and press those. I'm going to press them all to the left because one is a centre back, one is a centre front, and one is a side seam, and all of those seams on the bodice are pressed open, so I don't need to worry about nesting them. So the next thing I'm going to do is finish off the other side seam with bias binding because we need to put a zip in here, which is why I can't do a French seam with this one. I have sewn the right side of the bias binding, so the side that you can't see any of the raw edges, to the wrong side of the skirt, and I have sewn in the ditch of one of the folds of the binding, keeping the raw edge of the binding with the raw against the raw edge of the skirt. So I'm going to do the same for the other side, and then we can wrap it around and finish off the bias binding with the blind hem foot, which will give us a nice even finish. So I'm sewing on the bias binding, so we've sewn it to the other side, and we've now want to wrap it around the raw edge to enclose that raw edge. So I do this by, with my right hand I push the fabric flat, and with my left hand I push the binding flat. I'm using my blind hem foot because it has this guide here which I can run against the edge of the binding, and I've got my needle moved all the way over to the left, and I just want to make sure that I'm keeping the fabric nice and flat that side, the binding flat on the other side, and stitch, and you should end up with something that looks like that. So I'm going to do that for both sides, and then I'm going to go and give everything a press. Okay, so now that I have finished off my side seam and finished off my centre front and centre back seam and my other side seam, I'm now going to run gathering stitches along the top edge. I'm going to do it in the same manner as I did with the bodice. So I'm going to do a line of stitching at 3/8 inch and then another one 3/8 inch away from that. I am going to break my stitching at the other side seam so that I have gathers at the front and gathers at the back, which will just make it a little bit easier to distribute them. The pattern would like us to sew the other side seam shut just under the large circle, but I'm using an invisible zipper, not a regular zipper, and I prefer to sew my zips in with the side seam or the seam that they're going into open until the bottom. So I'm going to ignore that step, and I'm going to run the gathering stitches so I can then attach it to the bodice. So I've gathered the edge of the skirt and I have pinned it to the right side of the bodice, and I am sewing this at 5/8 inch, and I matched up the side seam, the other side seam, and then I matched up the centre fronts, and then I pulled the gathers between those notches, or between those points, so that I had everything nice and evenly gathered. So just finishing this seam off at 5/8 inch, and then we can press. My skirt's attached to the bodice, and I've pressed the seam allowance up towards the midriff. So the next thing we need to do is add in our zip, but as I say, they've got a regular dress zip, and I'm going to use an invisible zipper, so it's going to be a slightly different method. I have my zip pinned in to my dress. I have got the right side of the zip to the right side of the dress so that when you turn it around it's going to be the right way out. I have got the stopper of the zip at the large circle on this side, and I'm going to sew that in 5/8 inch the whole way down, and then I'm going to repeat that for the other side. First part of my zip's in. Now I have closed it up to make sure that I can close it, and then I've also marked in the points that I want to match the waist seam here. So I'm going to open it up, and I'm actually going to hand baste it into the other side to give me a good chance of getting these points matched up. I think you can just about see I've pasted it in, and I made sure that the waist seam matched up, and then I have sewn the zip in. This needs pressing. So I'm now going to sew the lining to the zip to seal that edge, and then we can sew up the lower edge of the side seam under the zip. We can add some bias binding to the hem, then it's all hand finishing. Okay, to finish off your zipper edge by machine, what you want to do is sandwich your zip in between the layer, the outer layer which you've sewn it to, and your lining, which should be relatively easy to do. And then you're going to match up the waist seam with the waist seam, and you want to overlap your lining by about 1/8 of an inch, because we're not going to be sewing right next to the zip teeth like we did for the outer. We want to offset the stitching, so we want our lining to be slightly smaller to account for that offset. It's as difficult to do through the viewfinder. So I want to pin that the whole way up, and again with just that sort of 1/8 of an inch. And we're going to be using our regular zipper foot, match up the notches, and we are going to be sewing about 1/4 of an inch away from the zipper teeth. So the line of stitching you can see here, which is where we've sewn up to previously. So as I say, I've got my regular zipper foot on, and I have the needle moved over to the left, and I'm going to run the edge of the foot, presser foot, against the zipper teeth, but I've got the needle as close to the centre of the foot as it will go. Okay, so as you can see, I've sewn 1/4 of an inch away from the original line of stitching, which is right against the zipper teeth. Before you trim anything, you want to turn it right side out. Just make sure that everything is where it should be. And this one is. I am going to close the seam, just the zip, just to make sure. But then you want to just trim off a little bit of this excess seam allowance in this area, just to trim a little bit of this bulk, and then we can close up the side seam. So I think you can just about see there that the zip closes nicely. The pattern does ask you to put a hook and eye in. I already hate side zippers, so I don't want to add a hook and eye to this, because I will find it incredibly annoying to try and put a hook and eye or close a hook and eye under my arm, so I'm not going to do that. I've tried it on and it closes to where I want it to, so I'm happy with that. So the next thing that we need to do is finish up the side seam below the zip, and we're going to use our regular zipper foot for that as well. Okay, so I have pinned my side seam closed. I've moved my needle all the way over to the right as far as it will go, and what we want to do is where the end of our zipper is, we are going to overlap that by about 1/4 of an inch. We're not going to be able to sew exactly on that stitching, so we're going to sew as close as we can and overlap by 1/4 of an inch, as I say, and then we're going to sew the rest of the side seam all the way down to the hem. So you can see here, about 1/4 of an inch away, I've overlapped by 1/2 an inch in the end, and I've backstitched here, and then I've just finished off the rest of the side seam. So I'm going to go and press this open, give the zipper a light press just to help everything lie nice and flatly. Then we can pin the lining to the waist seam for hand stitching, and we can sew on the bias binding for the hem. Okay, so I want to finish my hem with bias binding. I want to do that because I don't want to turn and turn this and make a narrow rolled hem and have visible machine stitching on the outside of the dress. There's no machine stitching visible anywhere else, so I'm going to hand hem this dress. So what I want to do is I want to put the right side of my binding to the right side of the fabric this time, and again I'm sewing in the ditch created by that first fold. I'm keeping the raw edge of the binding against the raw edge of the skirt, and I've turned over, I'll show you when we get there, but I've turned back the first inch so that I'll have a neat finish when I come to the end, but again I'll show you when we get there. Okay, you can see what I mean here. I've turned it back by just about an inch and sewn that down, and so when I come to finish this off, I'm going to sew over it by about the same amount, an inch, and trim my seam allowance, or trim the rest of the binding off there, and that will give me a nice clean finish when I fold everything to the inside. Once you've finished sewing the binding on, you're going to roll it around so that it's onto the wrong side of the skirt, but rather than wrap it around the edge like we did earlier, we're going to press the entire thing flat, and you want to see about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch of your skirt seam underneath that, and that's going to give us a really nice finish when we slip stitch this into place. So I'm going to go around the entire thing, pressing the bias binding over to the wrong side of the skirt. I've pinned the folded edge of the lining to the waistband or the waist seam, and I'm now going to slip stitch the whole way around that to secure it into place. You can, if you want to, press the seam allowance at 1/2 inch and pin it in place like this, and then stitch in the ditch from the front of the dress. That's something that I usually do, but again, this dress has not got any visible stitching on the outside, so I've decided to hand stitch the lining into place, and I'm going to slip stitch it the whole way around. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!